Good evening. Public trust in the institutions of society, including institutions of business, has declined almost everywhere in recent times. I think you'll agree. The confident market liberalism of the pre-crisis years is gone. So what are the objectives and responsibilities of businesses in this more complex age? How should they relate profit maximization, if that is indeed the term, to the common good? What are the implications for their culture and their brands? How do they juggle all these variables in a globalized and multicultural environment? The answers are not easy, but the questions are unavoidable for us all. Tonight, we are most pleased to have Lord Green and his wife with us as part of our new series at SBS on responsible leadership. The title of his remarks is Brand, Value, and Culture, Business in Society. Now, Stephen Keith Green, for those of you who don't know, Baron Green of Hurstpierpoint is a British Conservative politician, former Minister of State for Trade and Investment, former Group Chairman of HSBC Holdings, is the author of the best-selling book Good Value, Money, Morality, and the Uncertain World. He attended Lancing College and Exeter College, Oxford, received a master's degree in the United States from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He began his career with the British government in its Ministry of Overseas Development. He joined McKinsey early on as a management consultant, undertaking assignments in Europe, North America, and the Middle East. He joined Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation in 1982, and by 1998, yes, some years later, he was appointed to the board of HSBC Holdings as Executive Director for Investment Banking. His appointment as Group Chief Executive took place in 2003. 2005, he became Chairman of HSBC Bank, Group Executive Chairman in 2006. Frankly, few people are so well suited to speak to this topic. So please join me in welcoming Lord Green to our dais.
Ted, this is for me. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those rather too generous words of introduction. And to tackle a subject as broad as the one that Ted has just outlined is you might say, a bold, maybe over-ambitious task. But nevertheless, I'm going to try and lay out a few thoughts on the issues of brand, values, and culture in modern business life, partly from the perspective of having had experience of life in a sector, which is not the world's most popular sector, where plainly not everything has gone right over the years. Some months back, in the autumn or thereabouts of last year, there was an article, excuse me, in the Lex, in the FT, which commented on yet another case of a bank trading scandal, despite the obvious efforts of top management to instill a culture of social responsibility. I paraphrase it, but in essence, the point they were making was that if you want to exorcise this kind of behaviour, get the incentives right, no amount of cultural talk is an adequate substitute. Now, I certainly think that it's important that the incentives send the right signals, but the implication that culture in a business organisation is somehow of secondary importance is one that I think we should utterly reject. The more so because of the way in which the world within which business operates is changing. It's a cliché, but it's a cliché because it's true, that globalization is changing business models all over the place and increasing year by year the amount of cultural interaction within business communities, amongst businesses and in the market. And the obvious challenges that this poses are ones that we wrestle with every day. I start from a fact which Ted has alluded to in seeking to grapple with this complex topic. It's a fact that has been repeated often enough, at least in the Western world, that it risks becoming a cliché, and that is that there has been a huge breakdown of trust in society. If this is a cliché, it's because it's evident to all of us. And like all such clichés, it's worth looking at afresh. In particular, we need to note three aspects of this failure of trust: that it didn't start with the financial and economic crisis of 2008, that it's not confined to banks, and indeed it's pervasive throughout much of modern society. I have actually just finished reading Francis Fukuyama's most recent book, Political Order and Political Decay, which charts a lot of that breakdown in trust. But first, the trend of treating all institutions of society with increasing suspicion probably dates from around the 1960s onwards. The turbulence of that era, the one in which the post-war generation found its voice, had many proximate causes, as some of us are old enough to remember. The Vietnam War, the Prague Spring, the tensions of the Cold War, mutually assured destruction, the pains of decolonisation and apartheid, the civil rights movement, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and student demonstrations all over the Western world. It was a time which saw the media develop significantly more aggressive, more irreverent voices in its dealings with those in power and authority. It was a time when the demos found its voice, a voice which is certainly never lost since. And since then, survey after survey has shown a decline in public trust in institutions at large. The financial and economic crisis certainly put the banks in a very uncomfortable spotlight, but it isn't just the banks. Latterly, for example, in this country, they seem to have been joined by the energy companies. And in fact, the loss of trust is much more systemic than that. It is business as a whole, particularly big business, which has lost respect and trust, and indeed not only business, but all sorts of other institutions too, politicians, the police, not least the media themselves. The breakdown seems to affect indeed almost every institution of society. It also seems to go with a declining tendency to join up, so to speak. All kinds of traditional institutions have seen their memberships fall, from political parties to religious institutions, to the Scout and Guide movement, to Masonic lodges, Rotary clubs, you name it. All of them have seen declines in membership in recent years on both sides of the Atlantic. Society is becoming atomized. It might be worth a separate paragraph on the extent to which this is a true characterization of the Asian environment, which is in a different space, certainly from the Europeans and to a considerable extent North America too. In Asia, you will find, particularly in East Asia, a much stronger sense of cohesiveness, social cohesiveness, long-term focus, familial institutions that are still regarded as profoundly important, and so forth. I question how long that will last under the impact of urbanisation, but time will tell. As of now, there is a difference between Asia and Europe, but it's no coincidence that you will hear amongst the authorities in such places as Singapore and China and Taiwan worries about what urbanisation is doing to social cohesion, rather in the same way that people worry in this part of the world about what urbanisation has done to social cohesion. But society is not only becoming more atomised, it has become more questioning and often more suspicious about everything. And in particular, it has become sceptical, to say the least, particularly in the wake of the financial and economic crisis, about business and indeed about the capitalist system. To anyone who remembers the new dawn of a quarter of a century ago, when the major ideological competitor of capitalism finally collapsed, when Francis Fukuyama wrote his first famous essay, The End of History, it's always fair, I think, to remind ourselves that he had a question mark at the end of that title. This can only seem mildly ironic. 25 years of liberal market capitalism have seen massive gains in prosperity throughout much of the world, as well as the arrival of the digital age in which global connectivity at zero marginal cost and social networking is opening up unprecedented opportunities for individual and social development. And yet, capitalism and all that it represents is in the dock as it hasn't been for decades. So what is up? Well, we know that public disquiet with business has many roots. There is the destructive financial engineering that came to sum up the greedy days before the bubble burst in 2007-8. The, as it was described, socially useless creativity of the markets at their frothiest. There is the sense, too, that in many sectors, oligopoly has distorted the market to the detriment of the weak, the customer at one end, or the small business supplier at the other. There is a sense, too, that some public market takeover bids have been destructive of the real national economic interest. In particular, in this country, some bids by foreign firms for well-known British brands in recent years have received an angry and hostile reception in the public domain because they appeared to be cynical financial manipulations of real businesses and people's livelihoods. There's also the widespread public perception that some multinational businesses play fast and loose with the tax rules so as to squirrel away profits into low-tax jurisdictions and avoid making their rightful contribution to the public well-being. This is familiar stuff, I imagine. And lastly, and certainly not least, there's a general angst about the rising inequality of modern society. Like all of these other issues in the public mind, this isn't a peculiarly British problem. The extent of that angst internationally is revealed by the fact last year that a hitherto little-known professional economist could write an 800-page treatise on this subject full of tables and graphs and mathematics and have that become an international bestseller. Thomas Piketty argues, as will be familiar to all of us, I imagine, that rising inequality is inherent in the way that capitalism operates, and he ends with a policy recommendation for corrective redistributive taxation at the international level, even though he himself recognises that this has no chance of implementation. Piketty's thesis has been picked over extensively and will no doubt become the subject of numerous detailed academic analyses, PhD theses, and so forth. But two things are certain. First, that the degree of inequality has risen significantly since the 1970s in virtually all developed countries and most of the major emerging markets too. In the UK, it rose decade by decade, although interestingly, it does seem to have stabilised in the last 10 or 15 years or so. And the second thing that's for sure is that Piketty caught the mood of the times. People are deeply uncomfortable with what this inequality means for human and social well-being. This is probably not the moment to explore all of this angst and anger in detail. Some of the concerns are clearly based on anecdote or on assuming that the worst is typical of all. But even if there is a good deal of emotional hyperbole, the indisputable fact is that there is enough substance in much of it and enough reason to be deeply concerned about the social behaviour and impact of business that we need to reflect very carefully on the appropriate response to this widespread lack of trust in what business does. And that response needs to go beyond the obvious. It isn't sufficient, though it is indeed necessary, to point out that business provides jobs, generates the economic surpluses out of which pensions get paid, investment and social spending are financed, and so forth. As I say, that is certainly necessary. It is equally clearly not sufficient. And so I want to use the rest of this evening to suggest three areas in which there is work to be done if we're to seek to reassure the public domain about the contribution of business to the common good. First, there is the obvious responsibility of the public policy domain to get the legal and regulatory framework right for business. But businesses need to see this domain as one in which business doesn't just appear as a lobbyist for its own interests, but as a contributor to the effort to discover the collective good. At the level of headlines, it's easy enough to state what is involved here, albeit, of course, there are plenty of devils in the detail. Just to take two different sorts of example of what I mean, and the first inevitably comes from the banking world, given the background that I come from. We have learnt through the crisis that we need appropriate rules in the banking sector on capital adequacy, on liquidity, on leverage, on governance, on remuneration structures, such that individual benefits are aligned with the corporate risks, and so forth. We need those to support a banking system which is robust, healthy, profitable, and delivering on its basic responsibility to provide appropriate credit to the real economy. It is, of course, easier to say these words than to get this goal, to achieve this goal and get it right in practice. We've discovered in the last 5 or 6 years that getting the balance right is genuinely difficult, even if all parties to the debate on reform contribute in the spirit of goodwill. And it isn't yet clear that we've got the balance necessarily right, in particular in the European economies, and particularly in the Eurozone economies. Bank lending is not growing to small businesses, and it is one of the issues in the low growth that characterises the Eurozone. To take another sort of example, there is the perennial question that I've alluded to a couple of minutes ago of tax. The difficulty here is that many countries, including Britain, of course, have sought to use tax as a weapon in the competition to attract and retain business capital. Even at the European level, let alone at the global level, we're a long way from having harmonised approaches to tax policy. And so businesses will always have an incentive to exploit the opportunities provided for tax minimisation internationally. But we've also learned from a number of high-profile cases in the last couple of 3 years that companies that can play that game perfectly within the rules and yet fall foul of public opinion and even put their own business at risk by doing so. Hence the difficulty of balancing the laudable desire to have a business-supportive tax framework with the need to make sure that business pays what is seen to be a fair amount of tax. In recent months, we've seen the Brussels Commission launch investigations into whether 3 member states have been offering improper tax breaks to specific multinationals, and this saga, you can be sure, will run and run for some considerable time. It's the perfect example of a policy balance which is A, difficult to execute, and yet B, essential in regaining public trust in business. Those are just a couple of areas where the public policy domain has to achieve a genuinely complex balance if we're to get the policy framework for sustainable business right. And it is clear that both of them, and any other example, or almost any other example I might have picked, has an international dimension to it, which simply compounds the complexity geometrically. One thing I learnt in my 3 years as Trade Minister, which finished at the end of last year, is that doing government is so much more complex than doing business. There are simply more stakeholders, more thickets of legal complexity, more opportunities for review and challenge, more chances of unintended consequences, fewer opportunities to actually get things done in a meaningful way, and yet there is no alternative to that interaction between the public policy domain and business. And given this inexorable fact about the modern public domain, it seems to me that the best and wisest stance for business is to approach the necessary dialogue on public policy and regulation empathetically, on the basis of a shared intent to find the consensus which maximises the common good, not as a game of chess, as it were, let alone as a contest of poacher and gamekeeper, but actually as a collective endeavour. There will be those, however, who argue that the responsibility of business is to the owners of its capital, that it's not its job to define or seek to realise the common good. That's the job of governments. The job of business, they would say, is fully defined by its obligation to generate profits consistent with the law. Which takes me conveniently to the second area of work which is needed if we're to rebuild trust in the role of business in society. Because I suspect that few of us think that such a bold statement of the purpose of business is adequate any longer. I suspect that most of us would recognise that we have to balance broader goals and expectations, even if this imposes more and more unwelcome complexity. So we need to ask ourselves some questions about the fundamental responsibilities of boards and senior managements of business. How do we define them? And one way to focus this question is to ask, what is the proper relationship of values to value? What is the relationship between the goal of shareholder value maximisation to values as perceived by wider society? Or to put the question more broadly, what is the place of ethics or social responsibility or the common good in business strategy at board or senior management level? Looking back to the boom years before the crisis, this would have seemed to many a strange set of questions to put to the board. Those were the years of a market fundamentalism which held in effect that A, the market is the best and most efficient allocator of economic resources and that it's self-stabilising, which meant that B, businesses should, subject to the reasonable constraints and protections of the law, maximise shareholder returns. And insofar as it did that, it was ipso facto contributing to the common good. There would be few voices in the wake of all that we've learnt in recent years who would argue in this way with any confidence. We have learnt, have we not, that markets are not always an efficient allocator of resources. We have learnt, or perhaps we've relearned, that they're not self-stabilising. And it would be very hard to sustain the proposition that if a business has a product and a contract and it's legal, it doesn't have to ask any other questions about suitability. So if simple shareholder value maximisation doesn't fly, what then is the objective of business? And I think one way of looking at this is to think about time frame. I think that value maximisation, shareholder value maximisation, is compatible with a broader sense of social responsibility if, and only if, value maximisation over the long term is recognised as the fundamental objective of business. Value maximisation construed as a short-term objective cannot be so reconciled. And I think I would argue that boards are stewards of long-term risk capital. Shareholders actually come and go. Capital does not. Capital is, after all, not a financial item. It's not a book entry. Capital is real assets, people, things, intellectual property, and so forth, which do not, for the most part, move around at the speed of a sell or buy order. And boards have a responsibility for the investment of that capital in real businesses such that it generates an acceptably strong return over time. And I think it's clear that discharging that responsibility involves four main tasks. The first is, of course, to ensure that the business model is competitive, profitable, sustainable. As Keynes famously once said, in the long run we're all dead. No amount of care and attention paid to values in the company can substitute for a robust business model. Values will not save a business from going bankrupt. But any business model in any sector of activity will only have long-term robustness, if it meets three other criteria. It needs to value and invest in its employees, for one. That's probably a business school truism. But these days it's increasingly the case that many of those employees, and this is perhaps especially notable when it comes to recruiting graduates into the management stream, they want to know that they're working for a company which pays serious attention to values. They want a sense that the business is contributing to society. And in particular, many companies, and that was certainly true of my former employer, find themselves being asked searching questions by these management trainee candidates on, for example, the company's policy on the environment. And this is true increasingly not only for employees but of customers too, particularly retail customers, as one or two well-known high street brands have famously discovered in the last few years. The evidence is there that they care in many cases not only about fair trade and environmentally compatible products, they also care about fair tax. And then finally, businesses of all shapes and sizes find that they're expected to be good citizens in local communities wherever they have a significant physical presence. All of this comes together, I would suggest, as a broad and holistic understanding of a company's brand. We have perhaps become more aware of this in recent years. A concept that began life as a marketing concept has been broadened out. This is about something far more than market positioning, marketing image, and a memorable logo. The brand is increasingly understood as being about what the company represents. It sums up its position with its shareholders, its employees, its clients, and in the community. It sums up its position, in short, in society. It's a prism through which any strategically significant action or proposal, acquisitions for instance, should be viewed. The brand needs steady nurturing over time. It doesn't do well in a short-termist climate. I think that's a lesson that many of us have had to learn, or perhaps relearn, in recent years. But one obvious fact flies in the face of this argument for an equation of long-term value and values. As we're all too aware, shares are held too often for the very short term. It is still the case that the average shareholding in the public company in this country, and indeed around Europe and in America, has a life of less than 1 year. In what sense, therefore, can many shareholders be said to care about the long term? What reason is there to expect them to care about anything else than maximising shareholder value as quickly as possible and whatever it takes? And yes, there will always be shareholders who are like that. But surely the responsibility of the company itself, of its board, is clear. And so surely is the need to have a robust and courageous conversation with those who cannot see the connection between value and values, who, to put it another way, cannot see the connection between shareholder value and the value of the brand, understand in that broad sense that I've just been talking about. Such conversations need to be courageous in the sense that, yes, there may come a point in the dialogue where you in effect say to the shareholder, why don't you just sell? Because there is no convergence of perspective, and because what they seek is not compatible with the long-term responsibility of the board. All of this leads straight to the third area where there is work to do. Because it probably goes without saying that companies that get this right, that have a constructive engagement with the public policy domain, that have the right long-term perspective on their responsibilities, are the ones with a strong culture of corporate responsibility in their genes. The brand is, if you will, supported by the culture. And no brand can long survive a dysfunctional culture. So the cultural challenge is in the end fundamental to the challenge of regaining trust. It's a challenge for boards, of course, to ensure that the company's objectives and responsibilities are clearly articulated, that they're clearly understood throughout the organisation, and indeed not merely understood, but accepted and lived throughout the organisation. And it's much easier to say those words than to live it day by day and to see it through. It's the responsibility of top management to lead from the front on behalf of the board. Indeed, surely the leadership required comes not only from top management, but all the way through the system, if you get it right. After all, even the person with no one reporting to them on any organisation chart has the opportunity to influence others, other colleagues, clients, for example, for good or for ill. And so in an important sense, the best company should expect to find cultural leadership exercised by all colleagues throughout the system. That is surely the ideal. It is, if you will, the cultural equivalent of the famous story of the cleaner at NASA who, when asked what their job was, replied they were helping to put a man on the moon. Can this be measured or monitored or managed? Well, yes, up to a point. As part of the employee engagement surveys that most companies now undertake, yes, as part of the regular recruitment program of large organisations, which should surely focus not just on skills and aptitudes, but also on the values that recruits are likely to bring to the organisation and the role. And yes, there are procedural methods and remuneration practices which can help reinforce the kind of behaviour that nurtures the culture and the brand. But we also need to remember a fundamental truth about corporate culture, which is that it can't be mechanised. It can't be, as it were, performed. It has to be lived, which means that it has to be personal, particularly for the senior leadership, board and top management. If for them it's nothing more than rhetoric, this will become obvious to those who hear and watch them. And even if everyone knows the company's mission statement off by heart, that's not the same as living by it. In fact, corporate mission statements with the right sounding language about corporate social responsibility are probably nowadays as common as politicians' promises in the run-up to elections. It takes us back all too easily to the cynicism expressed in that Lex article I referred to at the start. Never mind the fine words, get the incentives right. As I said then, getting the incentives right is certainly necessary and difficult and sensitive. As chairs of board remuneration committees, perhaps the least sought-after board role nowadays, are fully aware. Yet it's equally plainly not sufficient. Not sufficient first because it's always a blunt instrument. As, for example, in any investment banking situation where managing expectations in the context of a savagely competitive industry is a constant challenge, to say the least. And secondly, and still more fundamentally, the more an organisation is run primarily on incentives, the less, almost by definition, it can have a true corporate identity, except perhaps in the minimal sense that it becomes little more than a sort of marketplace where the relationship between company and employee is nothing more than a contract, a transaction. And if that's true, then it's hard to imagine there being any meaningful shared sense of corporate social responsibility and commitment. And it's hard to see why such an institution could be expected to enjoy much in the way of public trust. So sustained leadership in nurturing the corporate culture is surely of paramount importance. Can it be shown to pay? Now there's a question. And at one level, the answer is probably yes. Isn't that what the whole experience of the last few years, the financial crisis, the corporate comeuppances, the breakdown of public trust, all tells us? But there's an important subtlety about this too. There was a 19th century English cleric by the name of Richard Whately, not well known now, who commented that he who acts on the principle that honesty is the best policy is not an honest man. Something similar might be argued to be true of corporate culture. At the end of the day, we don't or shouldn't aspire to good values, strong corporate culture, because they pay, but because they're right. And they would still be right even if they could never be shown to have a beneficial impact on the business. They would still be right even if they failed to gain public trust. I want to make one final point, which is a very important point to me personally, because it comes from personal experience. Experience, I suspect, well, I know, shared by many people in the business world, sooner or later in their business careers. And that is that sooner or later, something goes wrong. Something can go wrong in a very public manner. Something can go wrong in ways that the public doesn't discover. It may be something you have done wrong or something that happens despite your best endeavours and without your being aware of it. No matter how diligently a board or a top management work to ensure a long-term focus and a clear commitment to corporate social responsibility and the common good, no matter how much effort they put into nurturing a strong corporate culture, something goes wrong. Something happens which is painful and dismaying. I suspect we can all think of such situations, and I certainly can. What then? Do you then say the whole thing is exposed as a cynical charade? Is this just another piece of grist to the mill of distrust? Well, no. In fact, I would argue you only know the real metal of a brand, of a company, of a culture, in the broad sense in which I've been using that term, when you see how people react to something that has gone wrong in the sort of way that I've alluded to. Recognition, remorse, relearning, renewal are always possible, and sooner or later in everybody's lives, they're going to be necessary. The right kind of brand, the real evidence of corporate social responsibility, is when there's no denial or downplaying, but a determined effort to work out the full implications of the brand in coping with the challenge. Learning from experience, including bad experience, including the experience of having done wrong, both collectively and individually, is an essential ingredient in all life, if we think about it, and it certainly goes for business life too. But I end where I began. There's a task ahead for us all. It's not an easy one. There are no magic wands available. But the task of rebuilding trust in the realm of business is of critical importance if we care about the health of society. It's complex because modern society is complex. And the demands placed on business by the public domain are many-sided. The task will actually always be with us. I see no likelihood of a reversion to simpler times in the public domain. Those simpler times often seen, by the way, through rose-tinted spectacles from the benefit of now. But in any case, in the end, the essential point is the one made by Richard Waitley all those years ago. We need business with the right brands because they are the right brands, not because it's good policy, and therefore we should never let up. Thank you.